Nobody told me the child wouldn't speak. That was the part they left out of the briefing packet. I'd read the rest of it twice on the transit in from Velcon. The names, the ranks, the 8-point summary of where the treaty talks stood, the specific language both parties had agreed not to use, the dietary protocols, the cultural considerations for Velrith delegation members in compact administered spaces. 22 pages, every one of them useful, and not one of them mentioned that the Queen's daughter had not said a word to a stranger in 4 months. I found that out on my own, about 6 minutes into my first morning at Treaty Station Orithnall. The station occupied a converted survey platform above the Velcon northern shelf, 4 levels, pale gray corridors, windows that looked out over a mineral flat that went copper and rust at dawn. The compact had been running treaty sessions here for 11 years, long enough that the furniture had worn down to something that no longer looked institutional. That was the point of using it. Neutral ground tended to look like neutral ground when you'd had time to let the edges soften. My assignment was welfare liaison for the Velrith delegation. Practical function, not diplomatic. I handled quarters, meals, any medical needs that came up on the compact side of the arrangement, the small logistical gaps that the treaty officers were too occupied to manage. I'd done it 4 times before at different stations. It was quiet, useful work. I was good at it, or at least consistent enough at it that they kept sending me. You developed a particular set of instincts for the work, how to be present without being intrusive, how to anticipate without presuming, how to solve problems at the edge of a formal process that wasn't designed to acknowledge that edge problems existed. The Velrith delegation arrived at the 2nd hour of the morning watch on a Thursday. 8 people, including the Queen, 2 senior advisors, a court recorder, 2 armsmen, a personal attendant named Velseth who moved with the contained efficiency of someone who had spent years making herself invisible, and the child. I was in the corridor outside the delegation's assigned quarters when they came through. The Queen moved the way powerful people move when they're trying not to economically, without performance, her attention on everything at once. She was tall for a Velrith, pale violet silver in the way that was specific to the ruling lineage, dark copper hair arranged without ceremony for travel. Amber eyes. The briefing had described her as contained. That was accurate. She swept the corridor in 2 seconds, assessed the compact station staff assembled to receive them, and gave nothing back in her expression except acknowledgement. Professional, appropriate, correct. The child was at her side, one hand in the Queen's hand, the other holding the strap of a small bag that looked like it had been repacked 3 times in transit. She was small, 6 years old, the packet had said. She looked younger. Silver blue skin, the same amber eyes as her mother, dark hair loose and slightly tangled from the journey. She was not looking at anything. Her eyes were down, her shoulders tight, and she was making herself take up as little space as possible in a corridor where everything was unfamiliar and too large. I knew that posture. I'd seen it in field work, in transit hubs, in places where people had been through something that had not finished happening to them yet. The body learning to minimize. The instinct that had decided the best way to survive unfamiliar space was to become hard to see in it. You didn't reach toward that kind of posture. You let it exist, and you kept your own shape neutral, and you waited for the space between you to stop being a threat. The Queen introduced herself formally. I gave my name and function. She asked 2 precise questions about the welfare arrangements, meal timing, medical availability, and accepted the answers with a nod that indicated she'd evaluate their accuracy herself rather than take my word for it. The kind of nod that comes from having been given incorrect assurances before. I did not try to introduce myself to the child. She was behind her mother's shoulder, and I had no reason to step around that. I showed the delegation to their quarters, confirmed the timing of the first session, said I was available through the station comm system at any hour. The Queen said she understood. The doors closed. I thought that was probably the extent of my contact with the child. I was wrong about that. The next morning, the first formal session was scheduled for the 3rd hour. I was in the welfare wing, a small suite of rooms adjacent to the delegation quarters, used for exactly this kind of situation, when parties needed a place to be that wasn't a formal chamber and wasn't their sleeping quarters. It had a waiting room with low chairs and a table, a narrow bathroom, and a door that opened onto a small interior courtyard. The courtyard had 2 stone benches and a planting box along the south wall that held something with long silver-gray leaves I didn't know the name of. The leaves moved in the recycled air of the station in a way that was almost outside, not quite. Velseth, the personal attendant, arrived at the welfare wing at 10 minutes before the 3rd hour. She had the child with her. She told me, quietly, close, in a register that suggested she had been hoping not to need to say this at all, that the formal sessions were not appropriate for the princess. The child's name was Lyra. She was 6. She had been present for 1 formal session in the month since her father's death and had not recovered from it well. Velseth did not elaborate on what that meant. The advisors had recommended that she be kept in a less pressured environment during the treaty hours. She doesn't speak to strangers, Velseth said. She hasn't for 4 months. She communicates with her mother and with me and with her attendant at home, and that's the extent of it. She won't cause you any difficulty. She simply won't. She won't interact with you. Please don't try to make her. I said I understood. Velseth nodded, looked at Lyra, one of those looks that tried to carry reassurance without projecting it too forcefully, the kind adults use on children when they're not sure it will land, and said she'd return at the close of the morning session. Then she left. Lyra stood in the middle of the welfare wing waiting room. She had her bag. She was looking at the floor. She was wearing formal delegation attire that was a size too careful, pressed, precise, uncomfortable. Someone had done her hair that morning and it showed. I sat down in one of the low chairs against the wall, not the closest chair, not near her. I sat where I'd been sitting before they arrived, where there was a view of the courtyard door and enough distance between us that she had the whole room to herself if she wanted it. I had a maintenance log to review. I reviewed it. I did not try to talk to her. I did not offer her anything. I did not explain who I was or give her a summary of the room or point out the courtyard or ask how she was feeling or say anything at all about her father or her mother or the treaty or why she was here. I had a log to review, and she had a room to exist in, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and I did not need them to be anything other than what they were. She stood in the middle of the floor for 4 minutes. I know because I was working through a section of the log that took 4 minutes. The ventilation calibration records for levels 2 and 3, which were neither interesting nor short, and which I read with the same care I'd have given to anything else because the work in front of you is the work in front of you, and it doesn't help to be dismissive of it. Then she moved to the opposite wall, still looking down, and sat on the floor against it with her bag in her lap. I did not comment on this. The log was not particularly interesting, but having something to do kept my posture easy and my attention down and my face neutral, and I'd learned years ago that those 3 things mattered in rooms where someone was deciding whether a stranger was safe. You could be assessed without being watched. You could sit in a room with someone and take 3 hours to run the calculation without being hurried into a conclusion. Being hurried into a conclusion was the thing that was usually wrong about how people handled it. The urgency to be known as safe made you louder and larger and more deliberate, and every one of those things confirmed that you were something that needed to be decided about. 40 minutes passed. She moved from the wall to the edge of the table, sat on the floor beside it, still not looking at me. I turned the page. She looked at me. Not long, a fraction of a second, but she looked and I had not looked back, and about 3 minutes later she looked again. This time I knew she was doing it. I kept my eyes on the log. 10 minutes after that she stood up, walked to the chair beside mine, not the nearest one, the one beside the nearest one, and sat in it. She put her bag on her lap. She looked at the wall across from us. I turned another page. She was very still for a long time. The way that children who have learned to be still are still, not the comfortable stillness of a child who isn't particularly interested in what's happening, but the watchful stillness of one who is monitoring everything and trusting none of it. I recognized that too. I had been that kind of still at points in my life. You learn it when you need it, and it stays in your posture long after you've stopped needing it. And from the outside it looks like calm, but from the inside it is the opposite of calm. It is the sustained effort of containing a very loud vigilance. I finished the log, set it on the table, leaned back in the chair the way I would have if I'd been alone. She was looking at me from the corner of her eye. I looked at the ceiling. The ceiling at Treaty Station Orithnal was unremarkable. Pale gray, 2 conduit panels running across the width, the long strip of environmental lighting. Not interesting. But I looked at it the way a person looks at something that's earned their attention, and after a moment I let my gaze drift to the courtyard door, the silver-gray plants out there, the morning light coming through the glass. They were moving. The recycled air in the station ran through the courtyard in a particular way that kept them in slow, continuous motion, not dramatic, just present. She followed my gaze, looked at the courtyard door. I didn't say anything. I didn't gesture toward it. I was not managing the situation. I was simply sitting in a room where a child could be still or could be curious or could look at a door or could decide nothing at all, and all of those things were equally fine with me. She looked at the courtyard door for a while. Then she stood up, walked to it, pressed her face briefly to the glass. The silver-gray plants were right there on the other side, close enough that one of them was touching the glass at its tip, slow and continuous. She turned and looked at me, and I was already looking at the ceiling again. She went back to her chair, sat down. And then, without any particular announcement, she moved to the chair right beside mine, sat down with her bag still on her lap, and reached over and put her hand on my arm. I went very still. Not startled still, just the careful stillness of someone who understood that the thing that had just happened was fragile. Her hand was small and dry, and she had gripped the sleeve of my jacket, not the arm itself, and she was looking straight ahead at the wall across from us, and her expression was working hard to say nothing at all. I did not move, I did not comment, I did not look at her. After a moment, I turned my attention back to the wall across from us, and looked at it with the same lack of pressure with which I'd been looking at everything else. 2 conduit panels here too, a calm panel in the upper right, the station's standard gray with the faint blue tint that the Velcon atmospheric processors gave to the recycled air over long use. She held on to my sleeve. That was how we were when Velseth came back at the close of the morning session. She stopped in the doorway, and I could feel, rather than see, the specific quality of her stillness, someone encountering something they had not expected and were managing not to react to. I heard her draw a breath. I kept looking at the wall. "The session has concluded," Velseth said, quiet, careful. "The Queen will be a few minutes." Lyra did not let go. Velseth came and sat in the chair on Lyra's other side. She said something to the child in Velrith, low, very gentle, private. Lyra's hand tightened on my sleeve. I turned the page of the maintenance log. I was no longer reading. The Queen came in 10 minutes later. I heard her step, the specific sound of someone who moves with control entering a room where they were not expecting to have to be careful, and she stopped, and there was a moment of absolute silence. Then she crossed the room and crouched in front of Lyra. She said something. Lyra looked at her and then looked at the wall. She did not let go. The Queen looked up at me. I met her eyes for one moment, then I looked back at the wall. What I was communicating was, "I don't know what this is either. I haven't done anything," she decided, not me. The queen was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and looked at Velseth. They spoke briefly in Velrith. I caught 2 words, one of them was my name, mispronounced slightly. Velseth corrected it. Then the queen looked at me again. "She'll have lunch in the welfare wing." She made it a question, but it wasn't quite one. "If that's useful," I said. She held my gaze for 3 seconds, running whatever calculation she was running. Then she nodded and left, and Velseth stayed, and Lyra's hand stayed on my sleeve through lunch, through the 2-hour gap between sessions in the afternoon, right up to the moment her mother came back. That was the first day. The second day was the same, except that on the second day she moved from my sleeve to my hand about 40 minutes in. Just set her bag down and reached across and folded her fingers around my hand the way that children grip things, completely, without negotiation, the way that hands grip when they've decided a thing is worth holding and are not interested in hedging. I kept reading. The resource allocation I was working on the second morning was more engaging than the ventilation logs, a revision to the welfare wing's meal provisioning schedule that needed to account for the extended session timeline. I worked through it carefully, making the adjustments column by column, and somewhere in the 3rd column I noticed that Lyra's grip on my hand had loosened slightly. Not released, loosened. The difference between holding something because you might need it and holding something because you have settled into the fact of it. I did not comment on this either. After lunch, which she ate at the welfare wing table with her bag beside her and her free hand in mine, she fell asleep in the chair. Not immediately. She resisted it for a while in the way that young children resist sleep in unfamiliar places, the body giving way before the will does, the head dropping and then snapping back up and then dropping again. I did not move. I did not adjust my position. After the 3rd time her head dropped, I felt her lean very slightly, incrementally, against my arm, and then she was asleep. I sat with her hand in mine, and a 6-year-old asleep against my arm for 45 minutes. When Velseth came, I heard the specific quality of the pause she made in the doorway, longer than a pause should be, the kind that happens when you are looking at something and needing a moment before you can arrange your face into its ordinary shape. I looked up. Velseth looked at me. I gave her a brief, level look that said, "We leave her until she wakes on her own." Velseth sat in the courtyard doorway and waited. Lyra woke up 12 minutes later. She blinked, oriented herself, looked at Velseth and then at me, and her expression did a rapid inventory that I recognized, the checking of whether you are where you thought you were, whether the conditions that made the thing safe are still in place. They were. She could see that they were. She settled back and looked at the wall. After a moment, she picked up her bag and held it in her free hand. The courtyard became part of it on the afternoon of the second day. I'd gotten up to check the planting box. One of the silver-gray plants had a stem that was bent at a wrong angle, probably from the transit when the station had repressurized, and I straightened it carefully, working the stem back the way you work anything that's been bent wrong. Slowly, without forcing it, giving the material time to understand what direction it was supposed to go. Then I came back, and Lyra was standing in the doorway watching me. I sat back down on the bench outside. It was a narrow bench, worn to the particular smoothness of old stone. The afternoon light came down at an angle that made the mineral flat outside the station's west windows look like something painted deep copper orange at the edges, dusty blue at the center. I could see a corner of it from the courtyard. She came out and sat beside me on the bench. She put her hand back in mine. We stayed there until Velseth came to say the session was ending and the Queen would be along. I heard Velseth's voice and saw her in the doorway of the welfare wing, and then I heard her step back into the room and wait. She understood, by the second day, that the thing she was watching was not a problem to be managed. On the third day, something shifted in the morning. Lyra arrived with Velseth as usual, but she wasn't looking at the floor as much. She looked at the room. She looked at the courtyard door. She went to it herself, opened it, and stood in the threshold for a moment with the recycled air from the courtyard coming across her. Then she came back and sat beside me. She held my hand for the full morning. She didn't bring anything out of her bag. I worked on a station resource request that afternoon, filling out the allocation forms for the extended treaty session. Detailed work. Columns, confirmation codes, specific quantities. Lyra watched my hands move across the forms for a while. Then she looked away at the mineral flat through the courtyard window. In the early afternoon, she brought something out of her bag. A small object, flat, round, smooth, dark green. A stone. She held it in her free hand for a while, turning it over, and then she set it on the bench between us. I looked at it. She looked at it. I picked it up, turned it over. It was heavy for its size, dense, old, worn to this smoothness across a long time, not just one person's hands but probably many. A family stone. The kind of thing that passes through hands over generations and accumulates a particular quality of surface. I held it for a moment and then set it back down in the same place. This seemed to be the right response, because she exhaled something that was almost not a sound at all, and then her hand tightened slightly in mine, and she looked at the mineral flat through the station window. I looked at it with her. It was one of those afternoons where the light on the flat was doing something specific, moving, almost, the way light does when the cloud cover is thin and broken, and the gaps shift. The copper-rust color of the mineral deposit went through about 6 different versions of itself over the course of an hour. Nobody plans that. It just happens because of the physics of the cloud cover and the particular angle of the sun at this latitude at this season. But it's worth watching when it's happening, and neither of us had anywhere to be. The Queen came herself, on the 3rd afternoon, instead of sending Velseth. She walked through the welfare wing and out into the courtyard and stood for a moment looking at us, at her daughter on the bench beside a middle-aged compact welfare liaison, one hand in his, one hand resting on a smooth green stone, watching the light move on the mineral flat. Then she sat in the chair Velseth had been using, just inside the courtyard door, and watched the mineral flat with us. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, in trade language, careful, measured, as if she were setting something down rather than picking something up. She used to do that with her father. Watch the light. I said nothing. The thing she had said didn't need a response. She was quiet another moment. Then, he died in the spring. The spring before this. I looked at the mineral flat. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it in the plain way, without anything added to it, without any attempt to take the weight of it or redirect it or manage what she did with it afterward. The Queen looked at her daughter. Lyra was still watching the light. She had not reacted visibly to the mention of her father, but something in her posture had changed, not collapsed, not withdrawn, but gone inward, the way you go inward when someone says the true name of something you carry and you need a moment to receive it. She hasn't allowed, the Queen started and stopped and chose a different sentence. The court has tried everything. The advisors said give her time. Her attendants at home try very hard. Velseth would give her her whole heart if that were the mechanism. None of it, she stopped again. None of it asks nothing, I said. Everything asks something. Even kindness when you can feel the kindness working at you. She looked at me. I wasn't looking at her. I was watching the light on the flat. A wide band of copper had appeared along the western ridge, the sun at a very specific angle, the kind that only lasts for 10 or 15 minutes before it shifts, worth watching while it was there. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What did you do?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was an accounting question. She wanted the record, not the explanation. I sat in a chair and read a maintenance log, I said. She made the rest of it herself. The Queen looked at her daughter for another long moment. The copper band on the flat was already softening at its edges, the light moving the way it always moves on its own schedule, without asking permission. Then she got up and went back inside, and I heard her talking with Velseth in the welfare wing, low and very close, the register of two people discussing something that had shifted the shape of the problem they'd been working on. That evening, the Queen sent Velseth to ask if I was available for breakfast before the morning session. I said yes. We had breakfast in the welfare wing, the Queen, myself, and Lyra, who sat on the bench beside me and ate without speaking. The Queen asked questions about my background. Not the formal kind, not the clearance and credential kind, the kind of questions that were trying to understand what kind of person produced the kind of behavior they had observed. How long had I done welfare work? Had I worked with children before in the field? What had I done before this posting? I answered honestly. Field work, medical adjacencies, transit hubs, a long period early in my career at a refugee processing station on a border world where the work was primarily sitting with people while they waited to find out what was going to happen to them. A lot of the work there had been sitting. The action they wanted from you was mostly just the sitting, being a person in the room who wasn't going to require anything from them, who was simply available if something was needed and present even when nothing was. You learn to be comfortable with that. Most people aren't. It makes them feel like they're not doing enough, and the urge to do more is what breaks it. The Queen listened carefully. She ate with the same containment she carried everywhere, precise and unperformative. Lyra ate without looking up, but somewhere around the midpoint of the meal she moved her chair slightly, not dramatically, not a statement, just a centimeter or two closer to me. And when I reached for the water and put my arm on the table, she put her hand on my forearm. The Queen saw it. She did not react visibly, but she went a half-degree more still, the kind of stillness that is not composure but attention, and for a moment her amber eyes were doing something very specific, something that looked like grief and relief and a question she was not quite ready to ask, all present simultaneously without any one of them winning. I looked at my water. After breakfast, the Queen left for the morning session. Velseth was going to stay, but the Queen said something to her at the door, and Velseth nodded and left with her. Just the two of us in the welfare wing after that, Lyra and me, and the courtyard, and the morning. She brought the cord out that day. A small length of braided cord, dark blue-green, with 2 knots in it. She set it on the bench beside the stone. I looked at the 2 objects. I didn't pick them up this time. I left them where she'd put them, sitting in the morning light between us on the stone bench. After a few minutes she picked up the cord and worked at one of the knots, not loosening it, tightening it, slowly and with considerable attention to the specific angle of the pulls. Then she set it back. I was aware that this was something. I didn't know what specifically, and I did not try to find out. Objects and the attention given to them are a language. I had seen that enough times in enough places to know that the translation you build yourself is almost always wrong, and that the better approach is to be present while the language is being used without insisting on understanding it in your own terms. We sat in the courtyard that afternoon for 3 hours. The stone was on the bench between us. The cord was in Lyra's free hand for a while, and then in her bag. At the end of the afternoon, when Velseth came and Lyra got up to go, she stopped at the door of the welfare wing and turned back and picked up the stone. She looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then she came back and put it in my hand. I looked at it. Small, dark green, worn perfectly smooth. A stone that had been carried for a long time by hands that were not here anymore. She watched me hold it. I closed my fingers around it. She went to Velseth. I put the stone in my jacket pocket, and it was there for the rest of the week, and for longer than that. On the 4th day, I found myself thinking about the refugee processing station, the one I'd spent 8 months at early in my career. The thing about that work that had been hardest to explain to people who hadn't done it was the sitting. People thought the hard part was the difficult conversations, the medical situations, the decisions about resources. Those were hard in their way, but the sitting was harder. You sat with people in the long wait between when they arrived and when they found out what came next, and the only thing you were offering them was the fact that you were there and not going anywhere. And you had to be genuinely not going anywhere, because they could feel the difference between a person who was sitting with them and a person who was waiting to have sat with them. The second kind of sitting looks the same and does nothing. I had learned to be the first kind. I didn't know when I'd learned it, somewhere in those 8 months, somewhere in the specific accumulation of days when I had sat in rooms with people who were frightened and who needed, more than anything else, for the person across from them to have no agenda except to be there. I had done it enough times that it had become my natural register in certain situations. I stopped thinking about it as a technique, and it became simply the way I was when the situation called for it. The fourth day, Lyra stayed in the courtyard for most of the afternoon and did not bring out the stone or the cord. She just held my hand and watched the light, and at one point she pointed at the mineral flat, lifted one finger, and pointed at a specific place where the color was doing something complex, a vein of something reflective catching the angle of the sun, so that there was a brief bright line across the copper field. And I looked at where she was pointing and I said, "Yes," which was the right answer for what she was showing me, which was simply that she had seen it and wanted there to be a witness. "Yes," I said. She put her hand back in mine. The fifth day was the last full day of the treaty session. The talks had gone better than either delegation had expected. I knew this from the station's general calm, from the shift in the treaty officers' posture in the corridors, from the sound of the sessions being recorded rather than negotiated. There was a closing session in the morning and a formal dinner that evening, the first event where Lyra would be present alongside both full delegations. I spent the morning in the welfare wing. Lyra arrived by the second hour, and by the third hour we were in the courtyard again. She had her bag. She did not bring out the stone, I had that in my pocket, but she had a piece of paper and a small stylus, and she sat on the bench and drew something while holding my hand with her other hand. I watched the mineral flat. She drew for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in the pocket of her formal jacket. "That's going to crease," I said. She looked at me. It was the first time I had said something to her that was not a response to something that was already happening. Just a thing I'd noticed, said in the register I'd use with anyone. She looked at me with those amber eyes that were precisely her mother's and precisely her own at the same time, and there was a moment, the kind of moment that is very small and very significant simultaneously, where something in her face that had been absolutely still for 4 days moved. Not a smile, more like the early indication that a smile was a thing that might eventually exist. The face deciding that the muscles involved in that particular arrangement were not, after all, permanently unavailable. Then she took the paper out of her pocket, carefully unfolded it, refolded it in a different and more careful way, and put it back. I watched the mineral flat. The formal dinner was at the 8th hour. I was on logistics for it, place settings, dietary confirmations, the translation device setup at the Velrith end of the table. I was not a seat at the table, welfare liaisons aren't. I was at the edge of the room, which was where I preferred to be. You see more from the edge. The Velrith delegation arrived together. The Queen in formal attire, a deep blue silver that caught the light at the angle of her standing position, her copper hair arranged for the first time in something deliberate, the formal arrangement of her station made visible in the way it usually wasn't. The advisors, Velseth, the armsmen, and Lyra in formal attire that fit better than the first days, her hair done with more care, her face arranged in the particular expression of a child who has been told to be composed and has decided to comply. The tight shoulders from the first day were a little looser, not gone, a little looser. She was looking at the floor until she wasn't. She looked up and found me immediately, across the full width of the room. I gave her a slight nod. The kind you give someone you know when you're both in a formal setting and conversation isn't available. Her chin came up just slightly. She took her place beside her mother at the table. I went back to the translation setup. Dinner was 3 hours. I moved around the edges of it, checking things, confirming things, the work that welfare people do at formal occasions, which is mostly ensuring that nothing unexpected is about to happen, and that if it does, there's a response already organized. The conversations at the table were the kind that formal dinners have, a polite, careful, nothing that couldn't be reported later. The treaty officers on our side told me afterward that the Velrith delegation had been warmer than at any prior session. I believed it. People are different when a child they love is not having a bad day. I watched Lyra across the table when I could. She ate carefully. She answered when the compact treaty officer beside her said something to her. A short, practical answer in trade language. Technically her first words to a stranger in 4 months, and I saw the officer's slight double-take when it happened. The instinctive recalibration of someone who'd been told the child didn't speak and had adjusted to that expectation and was now adjusting back. I saw the Queen's hand go very still on the table for one moment. Then the Queen went on with the conversation she was in as if nothing had changed, because she understood that making something of it in this room would undo it. That was good instinct. That was correct. At the end of the dinner, when the parties were rising and the treaty officers were saying their formal closings, I was at the edge of the room collecting the translation equipment. Lyra had followed her mother partway across the room toward the corridor. I was 6 meters away, doing my work. Then she turned around and came back. She walked across the formal dining room of Treaty Station Orithnal, in her formal attire with her hair done, past 2 treaty officers and a compact recorder and 3 Velrith armsmen, and she stopped in front of me and put the folded paper from her pocket in my hand. I looked at it. Then I looked at her. She was looking at me with the steady directness of someone who had made a decision that they were not going to take back. Her face was not doing anything complicated. She had decided a thing, and the decision was complete, and she was waiting for me to take it. I put the paper in my pocket. She went back to her mother. The Queen was watching this. She had stopped speaking mid-sentence to one of the compact senior officers, who had the good awareness to understand that the conversation could pause. The Queen watched her daughter cross back to her side, and Lyra reached up and took her mother's hand. And then, in a voice that was not loud but was entirely clear, the first unasked-for sentence she had offered to her mother in the presence of other people in 4 months, she said, "Mom, that's him." The room, which had been doing the low-level murmur of a dinner winding down, went a half-beat quiet. The specific quiet that happens when something has been said in a register that doesn't belong to the event around it, when the plain truth of it lands in the air before anyone can decide what to do with it, or whether they're supposed to have heard it. The Queen looked at Lyra for 3 seconds. Then she looked at me. I was still holding the translation equipment. I had not moved. She excused herself from the compact senior officer. A brief, precise courtesy that the officer accepted with a grace that suggested she understood exactly what was happening, or understood enough of it to stay out of the way, and crossed the room. She stopped in front of me. She was taller than I was. Her amber eyes were not wet exactly, but changed. The way amber looks when the light inside it has shifted. She had been carrying something for 4 months, the thing you carry when you cannot find the door back to your child, and it was still there, but there was something else alongside it now. Something that had not been there before this week. 4 days, she said. She did the work, I said, all of it. You sat on a bench. Yes. She was quiet, looking at me in that direct, accounting way. Then she said, I have been offering her everything for 4 months, everything that was mine to offer. I know, I said. What did you offer her? Nothing, I said. That was the only thing left. The Queen's expression did something complicated and then became very still. not the controlled stillness she wore in sessions. A different kind, the kind that comes when something has arrived that you have been waiting for without quite knowing what it looked like. She looked back at Lyra, who was standing a few meters away holding her bag and the braided cord, and watching us with those amber eyes that gave away less and more than she knew. Then the Queen looked at me one more time. She didn't say anything else. She went back to her daughter and Lyra took her hand and they walked together to the corridor. Velseth paused as she passed me. She did not say anything. She gave me the small, deliberate nod of someone who has been working on a problem for 4 months and has just seen something that changed the terms of it. I gave her a nod back. I finished collecting the translation equipment. I went back to the welfare wing. I put the equipment away. Then I sat on the bench in the courtyard for a while, in the night version of the treaty station, the lights lower, the mineral flat invisible beyond the dark glass, the silver-gray plants against the wall doing their slow, continuous motion in the recycled air. I took the paper out of my pocket and unfolded it carefully. She'd drawn the courtyard. Not precisely, not to scale, not with any particular skill, but accurately in the way that 6-year-olds are accurate about things that matter to them, which is to say she'd drawn the things she wanted there to be. The bench, the plants, the window with the mineral flat beyond it. 2 figures on the bench. One large, one small, both looking at the window. No faces, just presence. I folded the paper carefully and put it back in my pocket. The stone was there too. I took it out and held it for a while in the dark courtyard, listening to the station settle around me. Then I put it back. The delegation left the next morning. I was in the corridor for the departure, as logistics required. The treaty officers did their formal exchanges. The Queen spoke to the compact senior officer briefly, precisely, and with a warmth that the officer later noted was distinctly different from the opening of the session. Lyra walked past me and stopped. She looked at me. I crouched down, because she was 6, and that's the appropriate thing to do when you're trying not to tower over someone. She reached into her bag and took out the braided cord. She held it out. I took it. 2 knots, dark blue-green, one of them tighter than it had started. She looked at it in my hand, then she looked at me. "Thank you," she said, in trade language clear. Then she went to her mother's side, and they were gone down the corridor, and the doors closed, and the station returned to the particular quiet of a departure. The kind of quiet that is not empty but rearranged, the space that was occupied having become a different kind of space. I held the cord. I thought about her father, who I did not know and would never know, except that he had watched light move on surfaces and his daughter had learned it from him, and was still carrying that knowledge forward in her body even when everything else had stopped. I thought about the stone, the weight of it, the specific temperature of old dense rock, the smoothness that comes from being handled across time. I thought about what it means to pass something like that to someone. It is not the same as giving it. You give something when you want the other person to have it permanently. You pass something to someone when you need to know that it is in hands that understand what they're holding. She had passed it to me, and I had understood, and that was what the giving had been about. I thought about the Queen who had offered everything for 4 months and had not known that the thing her daughter needed was the one thing a court cannot provide, a stranger who wanted nothing. A court is always offering. Advisors offer expertise. Attendants offer care. Mothers offer themselves, which is the heaviest offering of all, and the child can feel the weight of it and love it and still be unable to cross to it, because the space between grief and love is not a space that other people's offerings can close. You close it yourself when you are ready. The closing requires a door, and the door requires a threshold, and the threshold requires someone standing quietly on the other side of it who is not going anywhere and is not asking you to come through yet. I thought about sitting on a bench in an afternoon with nothing to do except not ask anything of a small frightened person, which is so simple that it is nearly impossible, and which I had not known I knew how to do until the situation required it of me. The thing about grief, about the particular quality of grief in a child which is different from adult grief in that it does not negotiate with itself, does not manage itself, does not perform, is that it doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to be witnessed. It wants someone in the room who can hold the fact of it without flinching and without trying to shorten it. That is the whole thing. That is what 4 months of advisors and attendants and a mother who would have given everything had not been able to provide, not because they were inadequate but because they all loved her. And love has a shape that grief can see from across the room, and grief is wary of shapes it can see. I put the cord in my pocket beside the stone. Both of them were there for the rest of the posting, and both of them came home with me, and I did not move them to a drawer or a case. They stayed where I could find them without looking. 3 weeks later, a short message came through the compact liaison channel from the Velrith Court. It was addressed to the Welfare Liaison, Treaty Station Orathnal, my name spelled correctly this time. It said, "She asked me today what a welfare liaison does. I told her it was the person who makes sure everyone is taken care of. She thought about that for a while and then she said, tell him that she thinks he is good at his job." There was no signature, but the channel ID was the Queen's personal diplomatic line, not the court administrative address. I read it twice. Then I put it in the same folder where I kept the maintenance logs from that week, the detailed ones, the ones with nothing interesting in them, which I had read with such care during those 5 mornings that I could have recited the ventilation calibration data for Treaty Station Orathnal levels 2 and 3 without looking. I left the folder where it was, filed correctly, complete. That was sufficient.